Daniel McConnell writes that several senior government sources have suggested that Ireland is set to relinquish the long-held rate later this year as part of a new OECD tax agreement in October, which seeks to introduce a minimum rate of 15%. A senior coalition figure is quoted as saying that we don't want to become an outlier in terms of a global tax deal. They say it's not worth becoming an international pariah, so there is momentum behind signing up to the 15% with some flexibilities. Elsewhere on that front page and on the front pages of all the broadsheets this morning, reaction to the British decision to grant what is widely characterised as an amnesty to British soldiers and members of paramilitary organisations. It's the lead picture story for the Irish Times, which shows Irene Connolly watching yesterday's announcement on television. She's photographed beside images of victims of the Troubles. Her mother Joan was shot dead by the British Army during the Ballymurphy massacre of 1971. The editorial in this morning's Irish Independent writes that the sense of grievance is shared by relatives on both sides of the divide. Murdered loved ones' lives ruthlessly cut short, and endless heartbreak cannot be neatly swept under history's carpet as mere legacy issues. Yet for some, they write, politicians, military and paramilitaries, hoping to seal off shameful secrets that might expose grievous wrongs, it is an act of irresistible expediency. Survivors can only regard it as another indefensible act of injustice. The story is on the front of the Belfast Telegraph and the Irish News. Utter betrayal is the headline there. Dr Tony Holohan's indoor dining advice to parents at yesterday's NPHET briefing is covered widely this morning. Don't bring the children is the front page lead headline for the Irish Daily Mail. And the Irish Star picks up on yesterday's story of the massive cocaine haul. Michael O'Toole writes that as many as 6 Irish crime gangs lost €15 million they had stumped up for the massive cocaine shipment found in Holland. The cocaine is the front page story for the Irish Sun. Hunt for Monster Cocaine Lab is the headline, with Stephen Breen writing that authorities are searching for a Breaking Bad style drugs lab. And pop star Niall Horan's successful career pivot into the world of sports management is covered across pages 2 and 3 of the Irish Independent. He talks to Kate Rowan about his talent agency Modest Golf, which he says is a disruptor in the market. The agency represents professional golfers like Tyrrell Hatton, Ireland's Leona Maguire, and the world top 5 disability golfer Brendan Lawler from Dundalk. The former One Directioner wants to reshape golf by making it more appealing to young women. He says that whatever young girls are into is usually doing quite well. Whether it be fashion, sport or music, they're a powerful group historically and even more so now. Drawing on his pop experience, he adds, the younger generation pretty much run social media and corporates listen to them. That's why I feel we can try to get rid of the stigmas around golf with the help of young girls.
The legislation to allow people to drink and eat indoors in pubs, restaurants and cafes was passed by the Dáil last night. It will now go to the Seanad. Under the new law, indoor service will be confined to those who are fully vaccinated or have recovered from COVID in the past 6 months. As TDs debated those measures, there was a substantial protest outside. For more, let's talk to our political correspondent, Paul Cunningham. Paul, let's start with what happened inside the chamber. Will you bring us through the night's events?
Well, basically, the main event for TDs was whether or not to support the government's Health Amendment number 2 bill, which is basically going to enable indoor dining to take place. There had been a lengthy debate all afternoon. There was another debate last night, and then it was pushed to a vote after 9 o'clock. And on account of the vote effectively being so narrow, David Cullinan, the Sinn Féin Health spokesperson, said he wasn't satisfied with an electronic vote, and so there was a secondary roll call vote, but the result ultimately was the same. The opposition was unified against the bill, more or less, and the government in favour, and the government has the numbers, and so the bill has now passed and will go to the Seanad. We expect, Rachel, that it will be considered by the Seanad on Friday, and if it passes all stages there, it could be sent to Orson Uachtaráin. The President, Michael D. Higgins, has to consider the bill within 5 to 7 days. It's open to the President to call a Council of State to advise him if this bill is repugnant to the Constitution. But the President is the person who decides the matter, so he can either sign the bill then or he can refer to the Supreme Court.
Paul, I mentioned in the introduction that there was also a protest outside. I'll ask you about that in a moment, but first I think we can hear from some of those who attended that gathering.
I really want a choice about what I put in my body, and I can't actually believe that it's come to this time that that choice may be taken away from me. can't believe I'm in Ireland today, and a choice about what I actually get injected into my body is not going to be my own personal choice.
Very much the same reason. I have 2 children, teenagers, and it's their future, and it's about freedom and democracy. And to me, it's very frightening to think that you're being coerced into taking something that is a trial drug. We don't know the long-term effects, and it's just the choice being taken away is very worrying.
This is not the country I grew up in. This is not the society I grew up in, which is an open and fair society. The politicians are not listening to us. They've gone along with what I can see is the draconian powers that NPHET has imposing, and the political will is not there. They're taking all of their advice and all of the control is within NPHET.
Some of those who attended last night's protest. Paul, will you tell us about this gathering? Was it mainly about the new law, or was it broader than that?
Well, it started around sort of 9 o'clock because the Dáil was sitting in Convention Centre Dublin, and it took over like half of Samuel Beckett Bridge right up to barriers on North Quay Wall, where people go into when TDs go into the Convention Centre, but also continued all the way down to Gill Street. I mean, I couldn't really put an estimate on the crowd. It was large, and the organisers on social media were claiming it was in the thousands. I couldn't really tell. It was loud but good nature, and was clearly timed to coincide with the government's health amendment bill, and people were opposed to that, and some of those voices you heard there, it related to this idea of dividing the society into vaccinated and unvaccinated, and forcing people to maybe get vaccinated when they didn't feel that they wanted to. So that idea of dividing the population was a key point. But they're also, of the people I spoke to, were in disagreement with the general COVID policy, the requirement to make masks, and also a deeply held view that media across all platforms, be it TV, be it radio, be it print, didn't give them a fair crack of the whip, and they weren't getting the information that they wanted to. I mean, it was a loud, good-natured protest, and it certainly had surprised the TDs who were in Convention Centre Dublin itself. It ended up, I believe, around 1:30. The barriers were taken away, but the TDs were debating late into the night on a committee stage of the local property tax bill, and because it's committee stage, it means TDs are able to talk for as long as they want, and that's what they chose to do. They were talking for quite a long time after the protesters had gone.
It was obviously a busy night, because after the Dublin Bay South by-election result, there was always likely to be a fair amount of interest in last night's meeting of the Fianna Fáil Parliamentary Party. What happened?
Yeah, I mean, the Dublin Bay South result was really bad for Fianna Fáil. The idea that they'd dropped 9.2% of their share of the vote, that the first preferences stood at around 5%. It was a bad one. And on account of that, the former Minister Barry Cowan had written a letter to all TDs and senators suggesting that they hold a meeting to consider the election results and the plight of Fianna Fáil. Now, the Taoiseach Micheál Martin pulled some poison by agreeing to the idea of a meeting, and that's going to take place on the 1st of September. And the meeting is going to consider not just Dublin Bay South, but all of the recent election results. And I think that's a point that Micheál Martin wanted to make, which was that, yes, Dublin Bay South had been a bad result. He said it was always a difficult constituency, but if you look at Fianna Fáil's performance in the round and in local elections, and they'd reconnected with Europe and now had 2 MEPs, that they were doing okay, and the onus was now on TDs and senators to sort of knuckle down, do the best they could in government, and this would sort of deliver more votes. I think that from some of the TDs I spoke to afterwards who would be critical of Micheál Martin, they really didn't like this idea, which he also referred to, that people needed to stop being negative and stop making comments in the media, because they took it as a suggestion that it was the criticism which was bad for Fianna Fáil rather than the actions of Fianna Fáil and the leadership of Fianna Fáil, which they have a real problem with. So you had in the meeting some ministers like Darragh O'Brien standing up backing Micheál Martin, and it was proposed ultimately by Eamon O'Keefe that now that everyone had spoken about it and a meeting was going to be called, they didn't need to talk about it anymore, and the meeting was adjourned. So they managed to talk about it to a certain extent, but the meat of it still has to come sometime around 1st, 2nd of September.
Paul, thanks indeed. Paul Cunningham there, our political correspondent. After reports of wrangling at the Cabinet table, the government last night published its summer economic statement. The statement says that while this year's deficit will be larger than originally predicted, economic growth will be better than expected. According to the figures, there will be scope in the budget for tax cuts and social welfare rises. More money for housing is also promised. John McHale, who's Professor of Economics at NUI Galway and a former chair of the Fiscal Advisory Council, is on the line. Good morning.
Good morning, Rachel.
Now, you say there's been a significant change since the last set of plans and projections back in April. What has changed?
Yeah, there's been quite a shift in strategy. So coming into the pandemic, the plan was to have a balanced budget and have the debt on a strong downward path. And as recently as April, the projection for the deficit by mid-decade was, essentially that we'd achieve a balanced budget, and that has changed quite dramatically. The plan now is to have a deficit of 7.4 billion by mid-decade, which is about 6.5 billion above what had been projected, and the debt-to-income ratio will be basically static at that point. So it is a big change in strategy.
And what's behind this change then? I mean, is it clear, for instance, how much extra money will be set aside for housing?
Clearly there is going to be a strong emphasis on capital investment, and I think housing will be a big part of that. And I think it's fair to say that a rethinking of budgetary policy was expected. We're in an era of very low interest rates, and there are strong spending pressures in areas such as housing and health and climate. So I think that we expected some change, but that it would be a sort of a slow movement back to a balanced budget. The surprise here is really sort of abandoning that target of achieving a balanced budget by mid-decade, which certainly sort of increased the risks that we might face down the road.
We can come to those in a moment, but just on what else this document tells us, what does it tell us about the government's tax plans?
The focus is very much on the spending side, with significant permanent increases in spending. Now, if you have permanent increases in spending, you really do need to fund it. So one of the surprises here is that in addition to substantial spending increases, they're also planning on some tax reductions. Now, they're relatively minor tax reductions, but the combination does get us to a situation where we're going to be running significant deficits.
Is everything here predicated on COVID being very much a thing of the past?
Yes, no, they certainly are planning for significant additional spending that's COVID-related into next year, and I think that is sensible. So there is a contingency, for example, of 2.8 billion that recognises the substantial risks that still exist around COVID. But certainly as we move out of 2022 onwards, the expectation is that there will be strong growth in the economy. But that despite that, the original plan to achieve that balanced budget has been abandoned.
Can I ask you about corporation tax? Because the main story in this morning's Irish Examiner is about that tax. It says plans to abandon 12.5% corporate tax rate. Fear of becoming international pariah drives rethink on OECD deal. Now, it suggests that the government may indeed abandon the low rate of corporation tax. How much pressure is the government under on this issue?
Oh, I would say it is under substantial pressure, and I think at this stage there is an inevitability, I think, that we will sort of have to move away from the 12.5% rate. I think the government had been waiting to see really what happened in the US Congress in particular, but substantial reputational damage has been done. Every international story was noting Ireland as a holdout. And given, I think there was always a recognition that it was likely that we would have to move away from the 12.5% rate, I think that reputational damage was just not worth it. So I think it's sensible to recognise the reality now and to embrace the move probably to a 15% rate. more openly.
John McHale, thank you very much for joining us this morning. That was John McHale. He's Professor of Economics at NUI Galway.
As the Dáil was passing those laws on indoor hospitality for people who can prove their immunity to the virus and their children, the Chief Medical Officer was advising people not to bring unvaccinated children into bars and restaurants, or for people to travel abroad until they're immune from the virus. Dr. Tony Holohan's advice came as the highest number of daily positive cases since February was reported, along with the rise in people going to hospital and needing intensive care because of COVID, at a rate described by NPHET as tracking towards the most pessimistic projections. Here's the Chief Medical Officer.
There is no plan at this point in time to vaccinate children. Like for now, to parents of young children, it's safer not to bring your children into indoor dining and other facilities, even though these kinds of things might be possible. I mean, that would be the responsible public health advice. And there will be, as we know, particularly as indoor dining does become possible, an increase in the availability of outdoor dining facilities.
Our health correspondent Fergal Bowers is with us. What more did NPHET have to say about children, Fergus? Fergal.
Yes, I think the central point from the Chief Medical Officer is that people who are not vaccinated should stay away from dangerous environments, and the CMO said it's safer not to bring children in indoor dining. That's the responsible public health advice, he said. And if families, parents wish to go out with children, dining outdoors is obviously a clear option now. We're in the summertime, the weather is generally better. People don't have to go indoors, and there's lots of outdoor options, is his point. Delta transmission among children can happen. Case numbers are rising in the age group 13 to 18 years. That's the second biggest age group where cases are rising, ahead of those aged between 19 and 24 years of age.
Do NPHET believe that Delta is changing the role of children in spreading the virus and what it's doing to children? Is it making them sick?
Well, they're saying the right thing at the moment is to be cautious about children, and if it proves in the coming months that there's evidence children are less susceptible or are less likely to transmit the virus, and that there's robust evidence around that, then we can all rethink the situation. The pattern of the virus in children is unclear. I think that'll properly reveal itself when the adult population is vaccinated. I think experts believe they'll understand a great deal more then.
Are children going to be offered vaccines, Fergal, and when?
Well, the National Immunisation Advisory Committee is looking at this, along with the question of mixing vaccines and whether booster vaccines should be given. They've yet to give advice to the Chief Medical Officer on it, but NIAC said at the NPHET briefing yesterday evening that the advice should be coming in the near future. So it's probable that vaccination of children aged 12 to 15 will happen. If it happens, it would be likely to be done through the existing school vaccination programmes. The first advice to come from NPHET, from NIAC, actually will be on mixing vaccines, but then probably following quite quickly the advice in relation to children.
On vaccines, Fergal, one of the protesters we heard in that report earlier described the vaccine as a trial vaccine. Is that correct?
No, it's not a trial vaccine. Clinical trials have been done on all of the approved vaccines that are available. Then they go for approval by the European Medicines Agency. They're examined here by the National Immunisation Advisory Committee in Ireland, which gives advice to the Chief Medical Officer, who advises the government. These vaccines have been rolled out to millions and millions of people around the world. There's ongoing monitoring of side effects and publication of those side effects and risks on a monthly basis here in Ireland, certainly, and around the world. And any extra advice on risk factors are updated regularly in terms of advice to each country.
Philip Nolan said that the rise in case numbers and hospital admissions is tracking towards more pessimistic predictions. What did he mean?
I think the most important thing to say about this is that what's likely to happen over the next 8 to 12 weeks, nobody knows. NPHET doesn't know, other experts don't know, government doesn't know, others don't know, I don't know, because there's so many potential trajectory possibilities, we were told last night, and it really depends on the level of social mixing. But Philip Nolan said the trend of the virus is ahead of the optimistic model, so it's heading more towards the pessimistic. So, well, what's the optimistic model? Well, the revised optimistic model based on moderate social mixing and an accelerated vaccination programme from next Monday takes into account the recent vaccination changes for Janssen and AstraZeneca for 18 to 35-year-olds. So it would see between now and end of September, 105,000 cases, 1,985 hospital admissions, 260 people in ICU, 335 people will die. The pessimistic revised model, based on much higher social mixing and other factors, 566,000 cases and 1,760 deaths by the end of September. But it's just not possible to predict what the trajectory will be, and it all depends on so many things, in particular the background social mixing generally and the impact of indoor hospitality changes.
Where is the virus spreading fastest at the moment?
So we got a list of the highest 7-day incidence areas: Carndonagh, Donegal, highest; Buncrana, Donegal; Limerick City North; Ongar, Dublin; Ardee, Louth; Dundalk, Carlingford; Blanchardstown, Mulhuddard; Rathoath, Meath; Dundalk South, Moate, Westmeath; Milford, Limerick; Lifford, Stranorlar, Donegal and Killarney.
Like with eating and drinking indoors, Tony Hoolan's advice to people without a vaccine was not to travel abroad yet. Are many cases being picked up from coming back into the country?
Well, travel cases are now heading towards almost 10% of all cases, 626 cases in the last fortnight. The biggest numbers are being seen in people coming here coming here from Spain, 385 cases, Great Britain, 161 cases, Portugal, 131 cases, much less from places like Turkey, just 15 cases, France, just 19 cases, Poland, 23, and Netherlands, 29 cases. So the NPHET advice is not to discourage people against international travel, which opens up on Monday, but it's just that only really vaccinated people should undertake it.
And staying with travel, are the rules for people coming in or back from Britain changing?
Yes, so people coming from the UK fully vaccinated don't need to quarantine at home for 14 days, and children under 12 won't need to have a PCR test.
And what did Ronan Glynn say about those who should be looking to be tested now?
Well, with the Delta variant, the symptoms are different. So the things to particularly watch out for now are headache, sore throat, runny nose or blocked nose or sinuses. And then as well as the traditional symptoms we know about: fever, cough, shortness of breath, change in sense of smell and change in sense of taste.
Fergal, thank you. That's our health correspondent, Fergal Bowers.
RTE Radio 1 Sport with Kia. For more on our 212 offers, visit your local Kia dealer or log on to kia.com.
And joining us with the sport this morning is Pádraig Lodge. Morning to you, Pádraig.
Good morning, Rachel. Well, play has been up and running since just after 6:30 on the opening morning of the Open Golf Championship at Royal St George's in Kent. Defending champion Shane Lowry, Padraig Harrington, Rory McIlroy and Darren Clarke are all competing. Greg Allen is standing by with the early news. Good morning, Greg.
Morning, Pádraig, and it's a beautiful sunny morning, blue cloudless sky, but there is already a breeze. It's about 10 to 15 miles an hour and it's blowing out of the northeast. But that has been the wind in practice all week, and it's likely to be the same or similar for the entire week. And as mostly is the case on links courses by the sea, there's little shelter from the breeze, so it'll likely be a factor in keeping the scoring in check. But still, there is a prospect of good scoring. This is not a particularly long course, and the kind of conditions you want for links championship golf. So play underway. Just over an hour on the Kent coast. We have an early outright leader. That's Andy Sullivan, who's 2 under after 3 holes, 1 stroke clear of Danny Willett, the 2016 Masters champion, and also JC Ritchie, welcome 1 under. First of the Irish underway will be the man who won the Claret Jug at Royal St George's 10 years ago, 52-year-old Darren Clarke. He's away at 8:25. Defending champion Shane Lowry tees off at 2 minutes to 10. In good company, he's got the world number two and tournament favourite John Rahm alongside him. And the world number 1, Dustin Johnson, at 10. Twice former champion Padraig Harrington tees off at 18 minutes to 1. And among the later starters is Rory McIlroy, teeing off at 21 minutes past 3.
Sound Greg, and we'll check back in with Greg for a further update just after 8:30. The BBC is reporting that Ulster GAA has made inquiries about hosting the Ulster football final at Croke Park. The game is currently fixed for Sunday week, the same afternoon as the Leinster football final, so there's no guarantee that the venue will be made available to them that weekend. In last night's underage action, Cork hammered Clare by 40 points in the first round of the Munster Minor Hurling Championship. It finished Cork 6-28, Clare 6 points. Dara Guinan scored both both goals for Tipperary in their win over Kerry. In the Leinster Minor Hurling Championship, Wexford beat Kildare by 5 points to set up a semi-final against Dublin, who were too strong for Meath in Navan. And Roscommon overcame Sligo by 7 points in Dr. Hyde Park to qualify for the Connacht Under-20 football final against Mayo next week. Lionel Messi has agreed to stay at Barcelona in a deal until 2026 that includes reducing his wages to half of his previous salary. The announcement is reportedly dependent on player departures that will allow Barca to fund the Argentina captain's wages. In tonight's Europa Conference League first qualifying round action, Sligo Rovers trail Icelandic side Hafnarfjordur 1-0 ahead of their second leg at the showgrounds, while the Aviva Stadium is the venue for Bohemians' game against Starnan, with a tie level at 1-1 from the first leg. Ireland hooker Ronan Kelleher has been called into the Lions squad to provide cover at hooker. The 23-year-old who scored 4 tries against the USA last weekend will fly to Cape Town with Welshman Alan Wynne-Jones, who's recovered from a dislocated shoulder, to join up with the touring party. Last night, South Africa A beat the Lions by 17 points to 13 in Cape Town. Conor Murray captained the Lions team. Undisputed world lightweight champion Katie Taylor will fight in Leeds on the 4th of September. Taylor will defend her WBC, WBA, IBF and WBO belts against American Jennifer Han at Headingley Stadium. The Galway races will be limited to a crowd of 1,000 spectators per day. The track had submitted plans to the government for 5,000 racegoers each day, but these plans were turned down. And finally, in cycling, defending champion Tadej Pogacar took victory on stage 17 of the Tour de France to extend his lead in the yellow jersey to 5 minutes and 39 seconds. Dan Martin is 57th in the overall standings.
Widespread opposition to a proposal by the British government to ban all prosecutions of Troubles-related killings and other crimes. This would mean there will be no future prosecutions of former British soldiers and police officers or Republican and Loyalist paramilitaries for crimes before the Good Friday Agreement, and an end to all legacy inquests and civil cases. Most of the over 3,000 killings during the Troubles remain unsolved. The British Prime Minister Boris Johnson told the House of Commons that the plan was to enable the province of Northern Ireland to draw a line under the Troubles, to enable the people of Northern Ireland to move forward. The Taoiseach said the proposals were wrong for many, many reasons and called on the UK government to honour the Stormont House Agreement. Our reporter Una Kelly has been speaking to some family members of people who were killed during the Troubles. It begins with Kathleen Gillespie, whose husband Patsy died in 1990 after he was strapped into a car and forced to drive an IRA car bomb into a British Army checkpoint.
I was flabbergasted. I can't believe that there's such a suggestion on the table, over across the board amnesty. That's really what they're saying. And I think it's ridiculous, because where is the justice in that for the victims if the perpetrators are being told they're not going to get prosecuted ever? The men who murdered my husband are still out there walking the streets. They were never sentenced. They were never prosecuted. I would like to see the whole thing being investigated, them paying for their crime.
Kathleen, Boris Johnson says that this legislation will help people in Northern Ireland draw a line under the Troubles.
He means brush it all under the carpet. That's what he's saying? Draw a line, I don't know. I won't draw a line. There are too many people who will object to this decision. Too many people will be hurt because of it. Well, we just feel cheated. And that leaves us dangling. It just means that it makes us feel in some way that we're not worth bothering about. We're inferior in some way, that we won't worry if they don't try to look for justice. It just makes you feel that we've been let down.
What would your message be to the British government?
Think about how they would feel if it happened to them. Personally, each one personally. Think about how they would feel if they had gone through something like I went through.
My name is John Joseph Taggart. My father was murdered on the 9th of August 1971 in Ballymurphy Massacre. I also lost my brother, who was murdered by the IRA 2 years later. He was aged 15. Only with described as sheer anger that after all that we've been through, after the campaigning for 50 years, and find out that our loved ones were declared entirely innocent. And then you have the British government just coming out with a proposal to stop us in the tracks of any further of progressing our campaign for truth and justice. Absolutely the disgraceful act by the British government.
If this legislation goes ahead, some families will not be able to get an inquest such as your family did. What do you make of that?
My heart goes out to them because I can feel for these families, because I know from personal experience of what you go through, what you have to do, the sacrifices you make throughout your journey for trying to get truth and justice.
My name is Julie Hambleton. I'm one of the campaigners for Justice for the 21, which is a group of families of those who were murdered in the Birmingham pub bombings in 1974. One of the victims that was murdered was my sister, Maxine Hambleton.
Julie, how did you feel when you heard the news about the proposed legislation?
Sick. Incandescent with rage. It is something that we never thought would be possible in a country that claims to have given the Western civilized world democracy. But it's all right for terrorists to kill as many people as they like because the government will allow them to walk free. Who in their right mind would agree to such legislation, not only being proposed but being implemented?
The UK government says it hopes this legislation will help people move past the Troubles. What do you think of that?
It's a load of rubbish. They have no concept of what reconciliation and what any kind of peace to families like ours looks like, because they live in a Westminster bubble.
Julie Hambleton, John Taggart, and before that Kathleen Gillespie speaking with our reporter Una Kelly. Baroness Nuala O'Loan is a former police ombudsman in Northern Ireland, and she's with us now. Nuala O'Loan, good morning. Thanks for taking our call today.
Good morning.
Are you surprised by this proposal?
We had all heard that there were proposals for an amnesty. I had not anticipated that not only would there be a proposed amnesty in effect, but also a complete end to all legacy inquests and all civil actions in respect of damage and injury suffered during the Troubles for the relatives of those who died. It's a terrible, terrible betrayal of the victims and their families, and they have spoken, I think, very eloquently on your programme there. I've actually heard one person welcome it, and that's Lord Dannatt, who's former head of the British Army. Yes. I haven't heard anybody else welcome it. It's a denial of justice, and it's a denial of justice in all its forms. You know,
Boris Johnson, just on that point about the army, Boris Johnson was very clear in the House of Commons yesterday. He said, the sad fact remains that there are many members of the armed services who continue to face the threat of vexatious prosecutions well into their 70s, 80s and later, and we're finally bringing forward a solution to this problem to enable the province of Northern Ireland to draw a line under the Troubles. In your view, is the British government's focus purely on the British Army?
No, I think it's much wider than that. I think it's on the whole cost of answering the questions which people legitimately have as, you know, citizens here in Ireland and in the United Kingdom and indeed elsewhere. I think it's a very clear breach of our international legal obligations. But not just that. You know, under the Human Rights Act, they brought human rights home. That was what they said in 1998. And that gives people the right to a timely and effective investigation of cases, particularly where there's a suspicion of state agents being involved in a death. And under these proposals, they'd be deprived of all their legal rights. I find it astonishing. And if I can give you two examples. One, we've just heard about the Ballymurphy inquests.
Yes.
So we can think back to Bloody Sunday. We can think about Ballymurphy, where the story which was told was not the true story, and innocent people died. But then think too, I'm involved with something called the Canova investigation. That's the investigation of the state agent known as State Knife. It's also investigating the deaths of 3 police officers, the deaths of a lady called Jean Campbell Smith, who died very early in the Troubles. Now, that investigation has put to the Director of Public Prosecutions over 28 files, which, in respect of which there has been no direction, no decision. Now, those 28 files relate to 17 murders and 12 abductions, which have been investigated. Now, the files began to arrive with the Director of Public Prosecutions in 2019, and there still is no answer from the Director of Public Prosecutions. This paper by the government says that only 9 people have been prosecuted. But the reason is that they're not being prosecuted is that they have stopped prosecuting them.
Yes.
And they've stopped making decisions to prosecute, so that it's not a question that the evidence is not there. In some cases, I grant you very few, the evidence is there. But if you look at those cases alone, Operation Canova has given the Director of Public Prosecutions over 50,000 pages of evidence. 2,000 new evidential statements have been secured. There is information to be had out there, and it may or may not lead to a trial, but we need to ensure that our country is built on the rule of law, and that we don't deny the rule of law and deny people the rights that they have in law. It is profoundly important.
If the British government wants to introduce a statute of limitations, even against a lot of opposition, realistically, can they be stopped?
I think it's going to be profoundly difficult in Parliament. I think it's interesting that immediately there's a response from the victims of the Birmingham pub bombing, so it's not just Northern Ireland that this will apply to. I think that the Irish government's response is predictable. It's only a few weeks since the government came out of a joint meeting and said that they were going to implement the Stormont House Agreement. And the Stormont House Agreement provides for not only truth recovery, but also for investigation. The government have the power in the House of Commons to do this because of their majority. Whether it would pass through Parliament, though, whether all parliamentarians would be prepared to say Britain no longer stands by the rule of law insofar as Northern Ireland is concerned, I would hope that there'd be more integrity in Parliament.
Baroness Nuala Lone, former police ombudsman in Northern Ireland, thank you for speaking to us today.
The European Central Bank has taken the first steps towards launching a digital version of the euro. It's given the go-ahead to the investigation phase of the project. It's expected it will take up to 5 years to implement, so it's quite a way off. But what might it involve? Anne Hayden is cryptocurrency lecturer with the Institute of Investing and Financial Trading. One thing they're emphasising, Anne, is that it won't signal the end of the physical euro, but what can we expect from this when it gets up and running?
Hi, good morning, Brian. How are you doing? So this is good news. Having a central bank create a digital currency, a stable currency that's pegged to the euro, it's effectively a soft landing for the skeptics who fear cryptocurrency, but who acknowledge that it's here to stay. In a way, it bridges the generation gap of knowledge and all things digital. We're living in a fast-moving historical era, the digital age, where a very important chapter in the history of money has been written as we speak. And if you look at the rate and speed of change in the use of money over the last 10 years, cash is now rendered virtually obsolete. So this announcement by the ECB is another exciting stepping stone in this journey, in this cryptocurrency journey as such. But as you say, we do have time. Yeah, sorry.
So will this enable us to transfer money around the continent, for example? And there's talk of a digital wallet that would be able to put money directly with the ECB, which raises the question, perhaps, does it make banks somewhat redundant?
Yes, I mean, this is the whole philosophy. The whole philosophy behind the creation of cryptocurrency, effectively back in 2009, was really, to take the retail bank out of the picture. So yes, they have a right to be worried. I mean, the idea is, so it won't be implemented. It won't probably be up and running till, say, 2026. Let's say in 5 years' time. And at the beginning, you will have, the way it will work is the maximum you can have at the beginning is €3,000 equivalent in your digital wallet. And a little bit like Revolut, you'll be able to, you can transfer that money, around the world, not just the continent, but around the world, back and forth. It's promised to be free, not the €3,000, but it's, in other words, transaction charge free. And yes, it takes the retail bank out of the picture. So,
we will continue to need them for lending. But the interesting thing about this is that it comes at a time when central banks are clamping down or certainly expressing skepticism about cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin. So does this validate those products, or will they simply be replaced by these regulated versions?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, there's an irony to all this. The philosophy of cryptocurrency is that it's decentralized and unregulated. That was the principle of, the creation of Bitcoin. And the central banks around the world, the Chinese have already established their own digital currency, the yuan. The Russians are in development of the crypto ruble. The Fed have mentioned that they're investigating it. So really what's happening is they're worried about financial instability, but losing control over their main economic tool, which is their currency. It's their means through which they can implement monetary policy. So it's a combination of it's a worry about this, possible instability, and it's also, but in a way, it shows a respect to the fact that digital currency isn't going away. It's a respect to a cryptocurrency market that's already valued at about $2 trillion. So you could see it as a good thing or a bad thing. It's very much it's a comfort factor for the skeptics, as I said earlier. It lies somewhere in between, the madness of Bitcoin and our traditional euro. Start with.
And on the subject of the madness of Bitcoin, it had been falling quite dramatically in the last few weeks. Yeah. It was being covered extensively. Has it settled down again?
Yes, it's very unlike Bitcoin. It's actually very stable at the moment. But I'd call this a period of consolidation after the massive crash that we had in May. We had a fall from $65,000 down to $30,000 in Bitcoin. And since then, the range has been between, it's been trading between $30,000 and $40,000, and the range is becoming tighter and tighter every day, which implies to anybody who studies technical analysis, it implies that there's going to be another big move on the way, because this consolidation phase has gone on for a few weeks. There's something big about to happen, whether it crashes below 30 or starts to recover back over 40,000, still has to be seen.
Anne Hayden of the IFT, thank you very much.
Plans to abandon 12.5% corporate tax rate is the front page lead headline for the Irish Examiner. Daniel McConnell writes that several senior government sources have suggested that Ireland is set to relinquish the long-held rate later this year as part of a new OECD tax agreement in October, which seeks to introduce a minimum rate of 15%. A senior coalition figure is quoted as saying that we don't want to become an outlier in terms of a global tax deal. They say it's not worth becoming an international pariah, so there's momentum behind signing up to the 15% with some flexibilities. Elsewhere on that front page and on the front pages of all the broadsheets this morning, reaction to the British decision to grant what is widely characterised as an amnesty to British soldiers and members of paramilitary organisations. It's the lead picture story for the Irish Times, which shows Irene Connolly watching yesterday's announcement on television. She's photographed beside images of victims of the Troubles. Her mother Joan was shot dead by the British Army during the Ballymurphy massacre of 1971. The editorial in this morning's Irish Independent writes that the sense of grievance is shared by relatives on both sides of the divide. Murdered loved ones' lives ruthlessly cut short, and endless heartbreak cannot be neatly swept under history's carpet as mere legacy issues. Yet for some, they write, politicians, military and paramilitaries hoping to seal off shameful secrets that might expose grievous wrongs, it's an act of irresistible expediency. Survivors can only regard it as another indefensible act of injustice. The story is on the front of the Belfast Telegraph and the Irish News. Utter betrayal is the headline there. Dr. Tony Houlihan's indoor dining advice to parents at yesterday's NPHET briefing is covered widely this morning. It's the page one lead for the Irish Daily Mirror, while Don't Bring the Children is the front page headline for the Irish Daily Mail. And the Irish Daily Star picks up on yesterday's story of the massive cocaine haul. Michael O'Toole writes that as many as 6 Irish crime gangs lost €15 million they had stumped up for the massive cocaine shipment found in Holland. The cocaine is the front page story for the Irish Sun. Hunt for Monster Cocaine Lab is the headline, with Stephen Breen writing that authorities are searching for a Breaking Bad style drugs lab. The Sína Fada is a news story for the second time in as many weeks. Digital COVID cert system not responsible for the mangling of Irish names, Minister says, is a page 2 headline for the Irish Times, with Jack Horgan-Jones and Harry McGee writing that a number of people with Irish surnames have received digital COVID certs with badly corrupted spellings or with no fada, including Cumann na Gaeilge director Julian Despawn. The A fada in his surname appears incorrectly on his COVID cert as a capital A with a straight line accent above. Minister Oisin Smith told the Oireachtas Transport Committee that our own system was extensively tested. He pointed to the processing of raw information from multiple sources like hospitals, GPs and pharmacies and the difficulty of correcting it after the fact. And 4-time All-Ireland winning camogie champion and TV presenter Anna Geary talks to Sandra Mallon in The Star this morning about her new documentary series for RTE2 television, which examines why girls quit sport. In making the series, she found that if girls dreaded going to training, they were less likely to continue with sport. As she described, if you're a 12 or 13-year-old girl and you dread coming to training for fear of being singled out for making mistakes, for fear of judgment, why would you go back? Adding that one thing she realised is that teenage girls don't actually like competition and they don't like the pressure, but that the element of competition and drills could be introduced, she said, once there was a fun element.
After reports of disagreement at the Cabinet table, the government last night published its summer economic statement. The statement, which gives an overview of the coalition's budget plan, says that while this year's deficit will be larger than originally predicted, economic growth will exceed expectations. The figures include scope for tax cuts and social welfare rises. There will also be more money for housing, but the opposition says the plans fall a long way short of what's needed. Meanwhile, as we heard just before the break there, this morning's Irish Examiner reports that Ireland may be about to abandon its low rate of corporation tax. The paper quotes unnamed senior government sources as saying the rate is set to be relinquished as part of a new international tax agreement. It's been proposed that under this deal there would be a minimum rate of 15%. The Minister for Finance, Paschal Donohoe, is with us in studio. Good morning.
Good morning, Rachel.
Is it likely that Ireland will sign up to this international plan and scrap the 12.5% rate?
So we are not in that agreement. I've indicated, and just to explain to your listeners who mightn't be aware of the full detail of this, there's a process underway through a global organisation to try to reach agreement on a new set of global tax rules. They had a really important meeting just under 2 weeks ago. A majority of countries signed up to an agreement to increase and put in place a minimum effective tax rate for the world, and Ireland is not in that agreement. We are committed to the negotiation to see if we can enter the agreement at some point, but I'm making the case for our 12.5%. It has been a key feature of our economic policy now for decades, and I'm so committed to it that I decided I could not enter into the agreement.
But if the country wants to be part of the agreement, won't it have to raise corporation tax?
It depends on what the final agreement is. And for example, the final agreement, the agreement as currently drafted, refers to at least 15%. So the question is in key features of the agreement, for example, in relation to the base, which is how much you can actually tax in your own jurisdiction, it does not have the certainty or precision that is needed for this country to make an evaluation about what to do. So whether we're in the final agreement or not will depend on the detail that's in it. And what we're going to be doing, Rachel, now early next week is I'm going to launch a public consultation on the agreement as currently drafted to really brief our business community, stakeholders in Ireland regarding what is there at the moment and how things could change. But the evidence of our commitment to standing by where we are is we're one of a small group of countries that are not in the agreement as currently drafted.
We heard earlier from John McHale of NUIG, former chairman of the Fiscal Advisory Council. He said that it's now got to the stage where serious reputational damage is being done to Ireland by this particular rate.
And I think the case for evaluating the effect on our reputation, I would argue, would be when the process has concluded and countries begin implementing whatever agreement is reached, if one is reached, and I think it will be. We've made huge changes in our corporate tax code. We phased out the so-called double Irish. We've brought in really significant changes, like, for example, eliminating the phenomenon of stateless companies from our tax code. Now, it's the case, Rachel, when you make changes like that, you don't get credit for it, but there are changes that still have to be made. And on the other hand, if I had announced very suddenly last week that we were going to enter into this agreement, there would also be issues there for people who've invested in our economy and have expectations regarding the predictability of our rate in the future.
Are you then preparing the ground for change? Is that what you're saying to people this morning?
The clearest evidence that I can give to standing by our rate is that we're not in an agreement at the moment. And we're not in
But you've
agreement.
said you're open to being in that agreement.
And the reason why I've said it is something that I'm open to being in is because I'm involved in a negotiation. And in any negotiation, particularly, for example, involving such friends and partners as the United States of America, I do think it's important not to rule anything out.
Right, so you're not ruling out a change?
I think it's very reasonable for me to say that if there is an agreement that I believe is in our national interest to be part of, I would recommend that to the government. And what I'm doing is making the case for our 12.5% rate and for the right of smaller and medium-sized economies to have a low rate as part of their competitiveness.
But if the other countries say no, what will you do?
We are, as I emphasised a moment ago, in a negotiation, and I believe in that negotiation it's possible to bring greater clarity to where we could be in the future. And I believe that there is enough understanding of where Ireland stands to be able to move forward in that negotiation.
There's also an awful lot of pressure on the country, isn't there?
But we've been in a situation, and many times before, Rachel, where our corporate tax regime has been under scrutiny, has faced many challenges. I've been in the studio on many occasions over the last number of years dealing with and explaining different challenges that we face at different points in time. And that continues to be the case. And I think when we're in those challenges, what is appropriate and necessary is we make the case for what we have. We negotiate in our national interest.
And then when they say no, what do you do?
We explain what is happening. And as opposed to me predicting hypothetical outcomes and what I might do at that point, given that this is a negotiation, I pursue what I believe is in our best interest.
So it's on the table at least?
What is on the table at the moment is an agreement that Ireland cannot be part of.
Now, let's talk about the summer statement released last night. There's to be more money for housing. How much more?
This will be confirmed by the government and by Minister Darragh O'Brien and all of his colleagues when Housing for All is confirmed. And there's an awful lot of work underway in Housing for All at the moment. The Housing for All strategy is a strategy the government will launch to respond back and build upon our efforts to deal with all of the challenges we know we have in getting affordable homes for our people. In terms of how much additional capital will be available for the government overall, that figure will move from €9.8 billion, which is what it is at the moment. That's the amount of money we spend in our schools, in our hospitals and building homes. That figure will increase to €13.4 billion.
Okay, so an overall increase of €4 billion. So an overall increase of €4 billion by 2025. That sounds a long way short of what people like the ESRI are saying you should spend.
Well, actually, the ESRI, my recollection is they did make an indication that it should be between €4 to €7 billion.
That's right.
But it's also the case that if we're going to be increasing the amount of capital investment that we have within our economy, we have to be confident that we can spend it, and that is going to translate into more new homes being built. And it is going to take still some time to build up the ability of our economy to translate that higher level of money into new homes. We were making big progress, though I accept it wasn't enough for many, in increasing the number of new homes that were being built before COVID hit. We've had a setback due to COVID, and what we will be doing...
Was the setback just due to COVID, though? To be fair, ever before COVID, if we go back to the last general election, housing was the big issue then, and COVID aside, it remains the big issue now.
In fairness, Rachel, I did say that when I was explaining where we are. I said that we were increasing the number of homes that were being built. We had done that quickly over a number of years, but we stopped building homes for a period of time because of public health restrictions. And of course we know, and I fully understand the real absolute imperative there is to be delivering affordable rent, to be delivering affordable homes for families to be able to buy. And this is why in the summer economic statement, actually for next year, we're planning a very significant increase in the amount of capital we invest in our economy. And
how much of that is likely to be in housing? It won't be additional 4 to 7 billion, sure.
And then when Housing for All is published in a couple of weeks' time or very soon, it will spell out how much of that additional money will go into housing. That has to be confirmed within government.
And have you agreed that figure as yet? No.
We've agreed the overall capital figures
within that, but not the amount for housing.
And within that, Rachel, I do have a fair idea how much of that will be going into housing. But the decision has not been made by government yet, and there's a few policy matters that we're still working on before we can publish Housing for All.
It's 5 years this month since the launch of Rebuilding Ireland, the last big plan. Can you understand why people are losing patience?
And that's why at each point when I've made the case for our efforts, I've also prefixed that, I think, in 2 occasions, at least in the last few moments, by saying, of course I understand why our citizens want to see more done quickly. Of course I do. And that is why in the 5-year plans that we've announced for the level of borrowing we will have within our economy, we're making a big step forward in how much money we spend to respond back to that. But it won't be just about how much more money we spend. It will be how we can reopen our construction sector, important decisions that we'll need to make with regard to planning, regard to other policy areas to translate more money into more homes.
Unemployment will remain high according to the figures published last night. The document says it will average 16% this year. What are you predicting will be at the end of the year?
We're predicting by the end of this year it will have come down again. I would expect will be somewhere between 13 and 15%.
God, that's incredibly high, isn't it? I mean, that's the sort of rate we saw in the 1980s.
But then this is why for next year, our expectation is we'll get around 220,000 more of our citizens back to work. It will halve the rate of unemployment in our country to around 8%. But actually, this is the very reason why on Monday the government published Pathways to Work. And what Pathways to Work is a really important plan led by Simon Harris, by Heather Humphreys. Michael McGrath has worked on it, which is about how we can make more training available, more apprentices available to get us to those figures quickly. It's also the reason why, of course, we're increasing capital investment in the way you and I have described to help drive the economy further.
Will you, though, be pressing ahead with plans to cut the PUP in September?
The government has made a decision that we will.
And you won't be going back on that, even if unemployment is still at 13 to 15%.
And let me explain why we're committed to doing that. The reason why we're committed to doing that is that we are actually going to be extending the pandemic unemployment payment out to the start of next year. We are going to be reducing it, but we're going to be reducing it gradually in 3 different moves. And the reason, Rachel, why we will be doing this is when, for example, myself and Leo, the now Taoiseach, and we're involved in bringing in the pandemic unemployment payment. We thought it would be for a few weeks, for a few months. It has now been in place for well over a year. And as the health emergency begins to ebb and improve, we also will need to change the kind of emergency payments that we've had in place. But we're going to do it in a gradual way, and by gradually phasing out the emergency expenditure that we have in place over a 2-year period, it allows our borrowing to fall and in turn allows us to invest in, for example, building more homes.
Just one final quick question. There was a protest outside the Dáil last night by people who argued that the latest legislation, the indoor dining legislation, that it's discriminating against people who aren't vaccinated and that this is wrong. Have you any sympathy for them?
I absolutely respect the right for peaceful protest and assembly. It's a cornerstone of our democracy.
But have you any sympathy for their point of view?
I always have sympathy for points of view, particularly given all the hardship and difficulty so many have gone through for so long in dealing with this awful disease. But I do respectfully and strongly disagree with them. And the reason why I do is throughout this awful disease, we at different points have had to ask different parts of our society to do different things to help us all. For so much of it, we had to ask those who are elderly not to leave their homes. And now as we make progress in trying to beat this disease, we are, it is the case, asking some not to be able to avail of the things we'd love them to be able to do. but it's what we need to do to beat this disease. And the alternative of it is, for example, hospitality, indoor dining.
Right.
I'm concerned we mightn't be able to open that for quite a while if we don't do something like this.
Minister Paschal Donohoe, thank you for joining us on Morning Ireland.
Thank you, Rachel.
We were talking to Fergal and Paul earlier about those laws passed in the Dáil late last night to allow pubs and restaurants to reopen sometime next week or the week after for people who can prove they're immune to the virus and their children, while NPHET were warning about the increasing spread of the virus and advice from the Chief Medical Officer that it would be safer for children not to mix indoors in pubs and restaurants. Sligo restaurateur Anthony Gray says he's concerned about the mixed messaging coming from the government and NPHET. He spoke to our reporter Amy Riada.
I probably disagree with them, to be totally honest with you. We have an awful lot of families that come to Sligo, and they all have young families, and they come to holiday. I think it's just a bit bizarre, to be totally honest with you.
How damaging would it be for your business if those families were to pull out of reservations and things at this stage?
Yeah, well, it'll definitely affect us because, we have a lot of bookings for 5 to 6 because you're only allowed 6 at the table. They're for mostly families, and I just don't get it. I don't know where this came from all of a sudden.
Will you be allowing children into your restaurant either way?
Absolutely. If they come to the door and they follow the correct guidelines, well, then they'll be allowed into the restaurant.
Amy also spoke to Louise Bayliss about her reaction to Dr. Houlihan's advice. Louise is a lone parent and founder of campaign group Spark Ireland, Single Parents Acting for Rights of Kids.
I would love to be able to go into a restaurant with my daughter. I don't have a partner, I'm a lone parent, and I would love to go and bring her for a meal. But with those comments now, I would be afraid of public outlash at her that I shouldn't be bringing her in. And it's that confusing message that really upsets people. So I would be very concerned about that. If it's not safe for her to come into a restaurant with me, how next month in September will, or, in the end of August or September, will it be safe for children to go into a classroom with teachers and 30 other pupils? And hopefully the message is, yes, they are allowed to be in school. But then if they are allowed in school, why is it not safe for them to be in a restaurant?
Professor Cliona Ní Cheallaigh is an infectious diseases and internal medicine physician at St James's Hospital. Professor Ní Cheallaigh, good morning. Thanks for taking our call again this morning.
Good morning.
Parents could be forgiven for being a bit confused now. What do you think?
So I suppose one of the ways to think about it is what I would do with my own kids. And I have to say I agree with Tony Houlihan, and even before he came out stating that I wouldn't have been planning to bring them to eat indoors. It's just not safe enough at the moment for me to consider bringing them in, because I'm going to try and minimise their risk of catching COVID. It's difficult because the government obviously have to balance, the needs of the restaurateurs to make a living and the needs of the economy against what is the absolute safest thing for health. But indoor dining, it's an indoor environment. We haven't really done anything hugely significant in terms of improving the ventilation and monitoring the ventilation in restaurants, and you can't wear masks while you're eating or drinking.
No.
So it's not the safest environment, unfortunately.
And that question by Louise about children going back into schools in a few weeks' time when they can't attend indoor summer camps and the Chief Medical Officer doesn't believe it's safe for them to go into pubs and restaurants, what do you think?
It's worrying. I mean, I think, we've seen a lot of Delta spreading. We know that kids don't get most kids don't get severely unwell with COVID and don't end up in ICU in the same way that older adults may, but they certainly can get very sick, and a proportion of them will get long COVID. So I really think we need to start now about thinking how are we going to get schools as safe as possible come September. So masks in secondary schools, we've been doing that for a while. That works. I think we should keep doing that. But I think we really need to think about significantly improving ventilation in schools. That's something that we can do that doesn't have an impact on the students. Putting in carbon dioxide monitors, making sure that the ventilation is as good as we can get it in the schools. That'll require building work. That needs to be done now. And we also probably need to reconsider primary school children wearing masks.
8:30, we'll get to news headlines shortly. Is Delta changing, Professor Ní Cheallaigh, what's known about the spread of the virus among and by children? And are they getting any sicker as a result?
So as far as I have heard, and I'm not a paediatrician, so there's a caveat, I don't work with children directly, but I haven't heard reports of children getting much sicker with Delta than they were getting with the other variants, but it definitely spreads more easily, and children are not vaccinated. So I think we will expect to see much higher rates of infection in children with Delta if we don't address those other measures like ventilation and mask wearing.
But are adults and unvaccinated adults, and perhaps vulnerable adults who have been either partially or fully vaccinated, any more likely to pick up the disease now that it's Delta from children than they were before?
So the virus itself is stickier. It's almost like if you're thinking about, those little seeds that stick to your clothes when you're out playing. I'm thinking about kids now, my kids coming in with seeds. It's just stickier, so it's much more likely to stick to somebody. So children are no different from adults. But the Delta is just stickier. So if you have the same amount of contact that you would have had with the original variant, Delta is much more likely to be transmitted from that same contact. So it's not specific to children, but yes, people are more likely to get COVID with the Delta variant.
There's a proposal for vaccines to be extended to under 18s, to under 16s, perhaps in the autumn. What do you think?
So I think that's a really sensible measure. And obviously there's a lot of very heated debate about it. Everybody wants to do the right thing for kids. Hopefully, kids that are vaccinated now are looking at 80 years of life ahead of them. So they have a long time to develop side effects if any are going to develop. But I think weighing up the risks and benefits, weighing up what we know about the vaccines, weighing up the risk of long COVID in children, I certainly personally would be keen to get my kids vaccinated as soon as it becomes available. And I think in terms of reducing the circulation of the virus that causes COVID in the community, I think we'll have to consider vaccinating kids as part of that plan in order to eliminate the spread of it in the community.
Professor Cliona Ní Cheallaigh, thank you for speaking to us again.
RTE Radio 1 Sport with Kia. For more on our 212 offers, visit your local Kia dealer or log on to kia.com.
Sports News, Pádraig Lodge, good morning.
Good morning again, Gavin. The Open Golf Championship began just after 6:30 this morning. There are 4 Irish players taking part at Royal St George's in Kent, and we can get the latest on the early action now from Greg Allen.
Yeah, and play underway, as you said, about 2 hours. It's a perfect sunny morning for golf by the Kent coast. There's about 10 to 15 miles an hour of wind blowing at the moment, which is light enough, but it is an added factor to Royal St George's. And we've a bit of a logjam at the top of the leaderboard, or we did up to a moment ago. No one's making a lot of birdies. We've 2 joint leaders, Danny Willett and Paul Casey, 2 Englishmen, both on 2 under par early in their rounds, and they're a stroke clear of a big group on 1 under par, which includes the recent Scottish Open champion Min Woo Lee, and also Victor Hovland, the very exciting Norwegian player, and the American Joel Damon. Just underway is the man who won the Claret Jug at Royal St George's 10 years ago, 52-year-old Darren Clark. His opening drive has found quite heavy rough to the right of the first fairway. The rough here actually are in Royal St George's as difficult as it's been at an open venue probably in the last 20 years. The defending champion Shane Lowry tees off just before 10 o'clock this morning in company with the informed John Ram. And there's a lot of talk about the low-key draw that the twice former champion Padraig Harrington has got alongside a qualifier Sam Forgan and the Australian Brad Kennedy. Harrington, though, is part of a plan by the RNA to pair experienced former champions with inexperienced rookies. And Harrington has always had a very close relationship with the RNA. He's been one of their global ambassadors in the past. And Harrington tees off at 18 minutes to 1. And out among the later starters near the end of the field at 21 minutes past 3, when the wind is actually forecast to rise to around 20 miles an hour from the northeast, that'll be the start time for the 2014 Open champion Rory McIlroy. And while the spectators are still arriving right now, it's a far cry from the thronged scenes on the first morning at Royal Portrush in 2019, but there should be a full capacity of 32,000 well before McIlroy tees off just after 3.
Thank you, Greg. BBC Northern Ireland is reporting that Ulster GAA has made inquiries about hosting the Ulster football final at Croke Park. The game is currently fixed for Sunday week, the same afternoon as the Leinster football final, so there's no guarantee that the venue will be made available to them. This weekend, 2,300 supporters will be allowed in Newry for Saturday's semi-final between Monaghan and Armagh, and the attendance for Sunday's semi-final involving Donegal and Tyrone and Enniskillen has been set at 2,400. So the financial difference between those sort of attendances and a potential 18,000 crowd in Croke Park is significant, but clearly there are scheduling issues to be worked out. The standout result from last night's action was a 40-point defeat for Clare to Cork in the Munster Minor Hurling Championship. Cork winning in Thurles by 628 to 6 points. The result looks certain to trigger debate on underage hurling structures in the Banner County. Former Clare hurler Colin Ryan commented on Twitter that he felt sorry for the players involved and hopefully it won't scar them, but underage structure and strength and conditioning has been in decline for a while. Good people in schools and in county have tried to rectify recently, but poor minors were cannon fodder. Alan Wynne-Jones is to rejoin the Lions squad just 18 days after sustaining a dislocated shoulder in a warm-up game against Japan. Jones has recovered quicker than expected and is travelling to Cape Town with Leinster's Ronan Kelleher, who's been called into the squad to provide cover at hooker. There was defeat for the Lions last night as South Africa A beat them by 17 points to 13 in Cape Town. It was a useful night's work, according to head coach Warren Gatland.
They came pretty hard at us in the first half, and being down 17-3, I was really pleased with the way we got back into the game, and how strong we looked in the second half. That was a pleasing aspect. We had a couple of tries disallowed, but we stayed in the battle. So that was the pleasing thing. The guys are in the change rooms saying there's no reason why we can't win the series. And credit to South Africa, they were very physical and very aggressive at the breakdown at the start of that game, and we worked our way back into it. So lots of positives and lots of things for us to work on. We needed that game, and it will be a lot better for that.
That's Warren Gatland. The Euro 2020 final was in danger of being abandoned if police officers hadn't intervened after fans without tickets forced their way through barriers at Wembley. Metropolitan Police Deputy Assistant Commissioner Jane Connor said in a statement that extra officers were deployed to support stewards when it was recognised that a large number of ticketless supporters were attempting to enter the stadium. Connor said without their immediate intervention, the game could have been abandoned. She also confirmed that 19 officers were injured while dealing with the trouble. It's Icelandic opposition for both League of Ireland sides tonight in the first qualifying round of the Europa Conference League. That's the third tier of European club football after the Champions League and the Europa League. Sligo Rovers are 1-0 down to Hafnarfjordur ahead of their second leg at the Showgrounds, while the Aviva Stadium is the venue for Bohemians' game against Stjarnan with a tie level at 1-1 from the first leg. The manager of Galway Racecourse, Michael Maloney, has described as extremely disappointing the news that the attendance has been capped at 1,000 per day for the Galway races. The course had plans in place to cater for 5,000 racegoers each day, but 2 weeks after submitting those plans to the government, word came through on Tuesday night that they had been rejected. Undisputed world lightweight champion Katie Taylor will fight in Leeds on the 4th of September. Taylor will defend her WBC, WBA, IBF and WBO belts against American Jennifer Han at Headingley Stadium. And finally, 2 Russian swimmers who've qualified for the Tokyo Olympics have been provisionally suspended by the sport's governing body FINA for suspected anti-doping rule violations. Evidence against the pair emerged from an examination of materials recovered from an anti-doping laboratory in Moscow.
We heard earlier from families of some of those killed in the Troubles and from a former police ombudsman in the north. They're among the widespread opposition to a proposal by the British government to ban all prosecutions of Trouble-related killings and other crimes, which would mean that there would be no future prosecutions of former British soldiers and police officers or Republican and Loyalist paramilitaries for crimes before the Good Friday Agreement, and an end to all legacy inquests and civil cases. The British Prime Minister Boris Johnson told the House of Commons that the plan was to enable the province of Northern Ireland to draw a line under the Troubles. Mary Lou MacDonald is leader of Sinn Féin. Mary Lou MacDonald, good morning.
Good morning, Gavin.
What will you do to stop this?
Well, I think there now needs to be a concerted effort right across politics here on this island and internationally to push back against this unilateral bad faith action by the British government. I don't think for one moment that Dublin in particular should afford any form of soft landing for Boris Johnson and his government, where they have clearly shredded the Stormont House agreement and very clearly, Gavin, delivered an incredibly cruel and shameless body blow to victims and survivors right across this island and beyond. So I think any notion or any signal to London that their proposal for amnesty, and not just the amnesty, but the ending of inquests, the ending of civil litigation, you heard from Nuala Olone in respect of the Ombudsman's role and that ceasing, all of that needs to be met with a wall of resistance. And I very much hope that the Taoiseach and that Minister Simon Coveney will not be so foolish as to engage in softening up measures or round tables or discussions around proposals that are completely unacceptable to all of us in every political party on the island, but more importantly, Gavin, that have been met with absolute shock and dismay. And people, this has been described as the mother of all cover-ups. I would describe this as the mother and father of all cover-ups. Yes. And the families, some of whom you've broadcast this morning, have said it all.
And we heard from the Taoiseach and the Minister for Foreign Affairs yesterday, both of whom voiced their strong opposition to this move. Are you opposed to any amnesty?
I am. And it's very important, just so we understand the politics of what's happening here. This amnesty is the brainchild of the British system. By the way, there was no amnesty for Republican prisoners who face convictions and jail time and all of the rest of it. The British government for a long time have been acting in bad faith, blocking the release of information to families and to victims, but perhaps most notably, certainly in this city, Gavin, in terms of the Dublin and Monaghan bombings back in 1974. And you will recall that the Oireachtas on multiple occasions passed motions seeking full disclosure from the British government on the information that they have on those incidents, and they flat out refused to give it, even when they were called on to do so by the Parliament here in Dublin. So it's been long-standing policy by successive governments, but most brazenly pursued by Boris Johnson's Tory administration, to give cover to their boys in the army, in the security forces, but not only them, Gavin, also their agents and proxies, those that worked with, on behalf of, colluded with the British state to kill citizens and civilians here, and more importantly, to cover up and to give shield not just to the men in uniform, but to the men in suits far higher up the establishment chain who directed and controlled these activities. In other words, this is a long-running narrative and saga wherein the British state denies and covers up the real truth of their dirty war in Ireland.
The statute of limitations will be wider than that. Is there any relief among some of your party members that they won't now face the threat of prosecution?
No, let me say there is widespread dismay and heartbreak and real annoyance. I mean, we very often and correctly cite instances of British bad faith. We could write, God Almighty, we could write volumes at this stage on that particular subject, but this is particularly low, and this hurts everybody. This is bad for the peace process in our country. It's bad for victims and survivors on all sides, irrespective of who visited the hurt and harm on their family and their loved one. Each and every person is absolutely entitled to avail of all of the mechanisms of truth recovery and the pursuit of justice, and nobody, including the British government, who is a protagonist in the conflict, has any right to deny those victims and survivors that comfort and that certainty. There is anger in Sinn Féin, widespread anger on this matter.
On truth recovery, will your party now urge the IRA and former members of the IRA to tell their story truthfully now and deliver truth that victims and their families, like Kathleen Gillespie, who we heard from earlier, are looking for?
Well, Gavin, I have told you already that we are signed up to the Stormont House Agreement and advocates and champions of that. And that means truth recovery from all sides. We have not been, and we are not the problem in this story. The problem in this story is the British state, which intervened, ironically.
Sorry, no, Gavin. The matters that you're accountable for.
No. I am accountable, and I have been accountable, and we are accountable through the agreement that we struck. And just remember, Gavin, the mechanisms for truth recovery were agreed between nationalism and unionism, republicanism and loyalism. The problem with this does not reside on this island. The problems arose after the agreement was struck. The British state intervened, the British government, to say, no, this can't happen. They initially cited concerns around national security. And since 2014, once the ink was dry on the Stormont House Agreement, the British system systematically stepped back from what they had signed up to. We are not the problem. The political parties on this island are not the problem. Boris Johnson is the problem, and the Tory government in London. And let me repeat, every mechanism, domestically and internationally, needs to be utilised now very effectively to call them out and to push back against that. And that includes the influence of the administration in the United States, any mechanisms available through the European Council, the United
Nations. You've made that point. I am a little constrained by time, so I would like to move on to another issue if that's possible. Separately, your party voted against the laws on reopening bars and restaurants here last night. Are you opposed to reopening this month?
No, we're not. Far from it. We want hospitality to open up safely with all of the mitigations that are required for that, and to open up for everyone. We are absolutely opposed to the kind of rushed, unenforceable and discriminatory legislation that the government forced through the House last night. And we set out our stall very comprehensively in the course of that debate. And I think it's a very great pity that we have now come to this point, that the government, because of their lack of preparedness and lack of competence, that the only answer they could come up with to reopen hospitality is to have a discriminatory and, let me say, a very divisive approach.
Mary Lou McDonald, thank you.